In this unit, we're going to discuss server storage. So basically our objectives are to describe server storage, then we're going to look at configuring local disks, we'll talk about working with virtual disks, and then finally storage spaces, which is a new feature in 2012. But first, an overview of server storage. When we use the term storage, we're usually talking about some medium that we can use for writing and reading back data, right? So basically, it's some technology that supports long-term storage of data. In this unit, we're going to talk about what these different storage platforms are with Windows Server, why you need it, and some common methods for accessing data storage. So as I said before, generally storage is considered some medium that you use for writing and retrieving, so it's long-term storage. In other words, unlike memory where you turn the power off and it's gone, it's a temporary thing. Storage is usually, when we talk about storage with servers, we're talking about permanent storage, or the ability to store data for a long period of time and be able to read that data back. It should be persistent, it should be able to survive a reboot, for example. You should be able to mount it to different servers if you needed to. So some of the things that you might see as far as storage devices, you might hear people talk about USB drives or flash drives, SD cards or compact flash, CDs and DVDs, magnetic tape. Good Lord, magnetic tape's old though, right? Solid state drives, which is newer technology, and then typical hard drives like you find today for the most part. And we'll talk about some of these different technologies here in this unit. So server storage is typically hard drives, right? So that's the most common type of storage. So although they could be solid state drives, so HDDs typically refer to technologies like SCSI and SATA or SAS, but they could also be solid state drives. Solid state drives have a lot more performance, so they're much better. They have much faster read-write times. They have much higher performance, but they do typically still use SATA or SATA Express interfaces. In other words, they use the same backplane, the same technology behind the drive, but the drive itself is SSD or solid state. They have no moving parts, so they require less power. They're faster, more resistant to shock. Lots of good reasons to use SSDs. They do not have the same capacity as hard drives, as standard hard drives. Obviously, hard drives you can get much larger. I think if you go to Best Buy today, to buy a hard drive, you can get a 2 terabyte hard drive off the shelf now at Best Buy, which was unheard of 10 years ago. So HDDs are quite large, but solid state are still relatively small in comparison. And also much more expensive. I should mention that as well. SSDs continue to be much more expensive than their HDD counterparts. So some of the reasons for storage. So we're going to need storage for the operating system files. The operating system itself requires a good bit of storage with Server 2012. Typically, we need a page file, which is virtual memory. So basically, when you run out of memory in a server, it's going to use a file on the hard drive as memory. So it's another use of the drive. Log files will need to be stored in storage, obviously. Our virtual machines need storage on our virtual machines disks or our VHDs, which we talked about previously. We'll talk more about that in Unit 10. Databases would need storage, documents, any files that have to be stored, right? So all the different things that we have to store, we have to find a place to put those things. We have to have a method to store that. So of course, storage is fairly important for servers. In fact, some servers are really just storage devices. So some broad categories of storage access methods. We have local storage, direct attached storage, network attached storage, and storage area network. So those are the 4 that we're going to talk about. Well, let's talk about local storage first. This is the simplest. Basically, this is storage media with a direct exclusive connection to the computer system board through a disk controller. In other words, a local storage is where the drive is internal. It's inside the machine. It's connected through some internal circuitry, directly to that machine. We're not using networks. Nothing is external. It's all kind of directly connected within that machine. So almost always inside the computer case. Usually refers to hard drives or solid state drives. Instead of CD and DVD, we usually don't call CD and DVD local storage. That's a slightly different technology. We certainly can't run a production server off of a CD or a DVD. It would be rather slow. Although I suppose you could. You could have it loaded in memory, which some people do, but that's not normal practice with a Windows server. It provides rapid and exclusive access to that device. So the disadvantage is that only the system where it's installed has access to that storage medium, unless it's a NAS, which we'll talk about later on. only that local system has access to the storage. So it's not very flexible. It doesn't give you a lot of flexibility of where that storage is mounted. You can't leverage a common storage device across many different servers, which we'll talk about later on. But again, this is the most basic type of storage. Most servers that you'll find, pretty much anywhere that you buy servers will typically have some local storage. Direct attached storage is where we have some storage device that has its own enclosure and power supply, but it's still directly attached to that server. So once again, it kind of has all of the same properties and characteristics of local storage, except that it's a device, kind of contained within itself that connects, and it could connect through a variety of methods. It could be SCSI, it could be a SATA or something like that. But it is still kind of a directly connected device. It's just it happens to have its own hardware. A lot of times you'll see this if you buy a server that has some kind of backplane for hot swappable drives that's self-contained. It still might use, say, 4 bays in the server, but it's kind of this self-contained little device that you slide into those 4 bays, and then within that you've got your drives. So that's one way you might see these direct attached storage devices. They could also be external. They could be, a small box that's connected in close proximity to the server, but again, it's the circuitry is really directly attached. It can't be that far away. But we'll talk about some other technologies that would allow you to do that. A lot of times these direct attached storage devices are where you'll find RAID configurations. So typically when you have an array of disks that's in some kind of RAID array, typically we're talking about these direct attached storage devices. So some direct attached storage devices have multiple interfaces, so more than one computer can access a storage medium simultaneously. So for example, with clustered Windows 2012, you can use one direct attached storage to cluster several machines on with one disk, say with like a Microsoft SQL Server cluster or something like that. But again, there are more technologies out there that might be more appropriate for doing something like that, which we're going to talk about here. And one of those technologies is network attached storage, or a NAS. I'm sure many of you have heard the term NAS, and I should preface this discussion by talking about SANs and NASs. A lot of folks in IT use these terms interchangeably, a SAN or a NAS. SAN stands for Storage Attached Network, and a NAS is a Network Attached Storage. And a lot of people in IT think these are the same device, but they are not. They are distinct from one another. So a Network Attached Storage device basically has an enclosure, a power supply, multiple drives, network interface, and this is the important part, it has an operating system for managing shared storage. So it has some kind of operating system that manages the file system within that device, and it's allowing other people, other systems to access that storage through that operating system. But that operating system ultimately is managing that file system. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as a storage appliance. So NAS is typically dedicated to file sharing, and they share files, so it shares files through some standard protocol like SMB, which you might know as Windows file sharing, network file system, which is common with Linux and Unix, or the file transfer protocol, which is a little bit more globally used, but it's not quite as secure as some of the other protocols. So these are some of the options you might have if you're operating a NAS. Obviously, if you're running a Windows Server 2012 and you're using it as a NAS device, it will probably be primarily using SMB or server message block. But if you're using a Linux machine, you might use NFS. Although 2012 does support NFS, it's not typically used unless you're in a Linux environment where you would need that protocol. So again, the important thing here is that the NAS has its own operating system, and that operating system is managing the file system. It formats those drives, and it manages the file system, and multiple computers can connect simultaneously. And since they're using network protocols, it can be accessed over the network, over the same network that we're using for everything else on our network. On the other hand, a storage attached network is basically it's similar to a NAS, except one major distinction is that it does not have an operating system that's managing the file system. There might be a very small operating system that's managing the device and managing the the disks themselves, but the file system is managed by whoever's using the storage area network. So in other words, with a storage area network, you create these logical units of storage within your SAN, and then you allow operating systems on your network to mount that storage as a local drive letter. So with a NAS, if I were connecting to a NAS, in Windows, for example, I would be going to the command prompt and typing netuse / something, or I would just type / server your NAS name / whatever to access the files that are on that NAS. I would log in and I would have access to files, and if somebody else logged in, they would see those same files, assuming we have access to the same files. With a storage area network, you can't just connect to it as a UNC path or using SMB or FTP or any of these other protocols that I talked about, or NFS. Instead, you use something like iSCSI or Fiber Channel, and you connect using basically iSCSI connects right over the network, so it's TCP/IP, and you can mount to a volume that's on the storage area network server and use that volume. But you are managing that volume. Once you connect to that volume, you're in charge of that volume. You manage the file system. If you want to format it NTFS, then you can do that. If you want to format it with REFS or something like that, you can do that. If you want to use one of the Linux file systems, you could do that. It doesn't matter. But you are solely you are the only system that has access to that iSCSI LUN or to that logical partition of storage, and only you can manage it. So you are the operating system in charge. Whereas in a NAS, the operating system that was in charge of that file system was on the NAS device itself, so it's a little bit different. Now, theoretically, you can combine these, right? So take a look at this diagram here. One thing I want to point out in this diagram is if you look on the left, we've got two SAN devices, and they connect to that SAN switch, and then the SAN switch connects to a variety of servers. So one important distinction here is that, and then notice to the right, there's another LAN switch which connects all the clients on my network. So with a storage area network, typically it has its own dedicated network. And each one of those servers that you see in the middle would have two Ethernet cards. Well, they could have a lot more than two, but at least two network interface cards. One is going to the storage area network, and the other one is to the standard wide area or local area network that connects to all of my other clients and so forth, and even to other servers. So they're two completely isolated networks because a storage area network uses a lot of bandwidth, and you have to have some special infrastructure in place for that. You don't necessarily have to have those special switches and gigabit and all that other stuff, but it certainly will work a lot better if you do, because it's a lot of data when you're talking about storage. And there are certain tweaks and things that you can do on a switch that make that work a little bit better. So in Windows Server, we can mount to a SAN device. We can mount a SAN device as a local drive letter. You'll see it show up in your list of drives in Device Manager and so forth. Now, one thing I want to make clear here is that when looking at this, the top server is a file server. Now, that file server could be using a SAN for its logical volume, for its data storage. So maybe first I have a SAN, which I mount as a local drive letter on that file server, and that becomes the storage for my file server. And then my clients out on the network, we have 3 clients, our Windows, Linux, and Mac client. They're accessing files on there using technology that I would classify as a NAS. So basically, I'm turning a Windows 2012 server into a NAS using a SAN. So now we have both of those technologies working together. So it's NAS doesn't necessarily have to be a self-encompassed technology. We could be using these technologies that we have laying around our data center to set up a NAS, for example. So again, it's just really important to make this distinction between a NAS and a SAN. In the next slide, we're going to talk about how to configure local disks.